October 3, 1944. A flat, muddy field somewhere in the Netherlands near the town of Overloon. Private first class. Edward Sullivan pressed his body against the cold earth of the trench wall, gripping his M1 Garand so tightly his knuckles had turned white. 50 yards to his left and right. The men of his platoon did the same. 40 American soldiers crouched behind sandbags in a defensive ditch that everyone said would be their grave. The German tanks were coming. He could hear them before he could see them. That low, grinding rumble that seemed to come from everywhere at once, vibrating through the ground and into his bones. Then they crested the ridge. Panzers, at least a dozen of them, spread across the open field in an armored wedge that looked absolutely unstoppable. This was supposed to be a suicide mission. Everyone knew it. 40 infantrymen with rifles against 14 tanks. The mathematics of death were simple and brutal. But Sergeant Thomas Garrett had promised them something different. The sergeant, who had grown up on a cattle ranch in Wyoming, who had spent 3 weeks digging and measuring and calculating while everyone called him crazy. The sergeant who had looked at this flat, empty field and seen something that no one else could see. Edward watched the lead Panzer approach their position. 300 yards, 200, 150. The tank's commander was visible in the open hatch, scanning the horizon through binoculars, completely confident in his armor's invincibility. He had probably rolled over 100 defensive positions just like this one. Infantry and trenches were targets, not threats. 100 yards, 75, 50, and then the ground opened up beneath him. The Panzer's front dropped into a hidden ditch, not the trench where Edward was hiding, but another one 30 yards ahead, invisible beneath a layer of branches and mud. The tank tilted forward, its momentum carrying it down, and for one impossible second, it seemed to hang in the air at a 45-degree angle. Then it flipped. 32 tons of German steel rotated over its own nose and crashed onto its back like a turtle knocked off a rock. The tank commander was thrown from the hatch. The engine screamed and died, and the second Panzer, following too close behind, had no time to stop. Edward watched in disbelief as tank after tank drove into the trap. Some flipped forward like the first. Others tilted sideways and rolled. Others simply buried their noses in the far wall of the ditch and stuck there, their rear ends pointing at the sky like monuments to miscalculation. In less than 4 minutes, 14 German tanks were destroyed, disabled, or hopelessly stuck. The armored assault that should have crushed Edward's platoon had been stopped by nothing more than a hole in the ground, a hole that Sergeant Garrett had dug with the same patient expertise he had once used to build cattle guards back in Wyoming. And the men who had mocked him, who had called his trap stupid and his calculations worthless, could only stare at the chaos before them and realize they had been completely, utterly wrong. If you are watching from anywhere in the world, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. We bring you stories from World War II that reveal what happens when ordinary people refuse to accept impossible odds, when one person's unconventional thinking changes everything. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from today. These stories survive because we remember them together. Thomas Garrett was born in 1912 on a cattle ranch outside Sheridan, Wyoming, the middle child of a family that had worked the same land since his grandfather drove the first herd up from Texas in 1882. He grew up in a world of vast open spaces, brutal winters, and problems that had to be solved with whatever materials were at hand. The Garrett Ranch sprawled across 12,000 acres of high plains and foothills, a landscape that taught hard lessons to anyone who tried to tame it. The summers were short and intense, the winters long and merciless. Blizzards could trap a man for weeks. Droughts could destroy a year's work in a single season. The land did not forgive mistakes. The ranch was remote, 30 miles from the nearest town over roads that became impassable for months at a time. When something broke, you fixed it yourself or did without. When an animal got sick, you treated it with what you had or watched it die. When the creek flooded or the well ran dry or the wolves came down from the mountains, you adapted or you failed. Thomas learned to think this way before he learned to read. His father, William Garrett, was a practical man who believed that every problem had a solution if you studied it long enough. The key was observation. You watched how things behaved, you noticed patterns, you tested theories with small experiments before committing to large ones. The most important lesson came when Thomas was 14. A pack of wolves had been killing calves, 3 in 2 weeks, and his father was losing money he could not afford to lose. The obvious solution was to hunt the wolves, but William was too busy with other ranch work to spend days tracking predators through the mountains. Instead, he built a trap. Not a snare or a cage, but something more subtle. A series of ditches dug into the ground around the pasture where the calves grazed. The ditches were narrow and deep, hidden beneath layers of brush, positioned at angles that Thomas did not understand. The wolves came that night. Thomas watched from the barn as the pack approached the pasture, moving with the confident silence of predators who had hunted this ground before. The lead wolf trotted forward and fell. Not into a pit exactly. The ditch was not deep enough to trap the animal, but it was deep enough to break its stride, to disrupt its momentum at exactly the wrong moment. The wolf stumbled, rolled, and by the time it regained its footing, William Garrett was there with his rifle. 3 wolves died that night. The rest never returned. Thomas spent the next week studying those ditches, measuring their dimensions, trying to understand why they had worked. His father explained the principles. A running animal builds momentum that it cannot instantly stop. If you disrupt that momentum at the right angle, the animal's own speed becomes its enemy. The key was not depth but geometry, the relationship between the ditch's width, its angle, and the target's center of gravity. Thomas never forgot those lessons. He applied them throughout his youth, building cattle guards that stopped steers without injuring them, designing irrigation channels that controlled water flow, creating barriers that shaped the movement of animals across the ranch's vast acreage. By the time he was 20, he could look at any creature, horse, cow, wolf or man, and calculate exactly what kind of obstacle would stop it, what dimensions were needed, what angles would transform momentum from an advantage into a fatal weakness. His reputation spread among neighboring ranchers. When someone had a problem with predators or wandering livestock, they came to Thomas Garrett. He never charged for his advice, only asked that people share what they learned, so the knowledge would spread. His father had taught him that wisdom was worthless if you kept it to yourself. When war came in 1941, Thomas enlisted immediately. He was 29 years old, unmarried, and possessed of skills that seemed utterly useless for military service. He could rope a steer from horseback at full gallop. He could shoe a horse, mend a fence and read the weather in the clouds before the storm arrived. He could survive alone in the wilderness for weeks, with nothing but a knife and his wits. None of these abilities appeared on any Army qualification test. He was assigned to the infantry, trained to march and shoot and follow orders. His commanding officers saw nothing special in the quiet rancher from Wyoming who did his duty without complaint and never volunteered for anything. Thomas Garrett was simply another body in uniform, one of millions being processed through the vast machinery of war. But Thomas was watching, learning, adapting the lessons of his father's ranch to the strange new world of military combat, and waiting for the moment when his particular kind of knowledge might matter. Thomas Garrett landed in Normandy 3 weeks after D-Day, part of the massive reinforcement wave that poured into France throughout the summer of 1944. His first experience of combat was chaos, the hedgerow fighting that turned every field into a fortress and every road into an ambush corridor. The bocage country of Normandy was nothing like Wyoming. The fields were small, enclosed by ancient earthen walls, topped with dense vegetation. Visibility was measured in yards, not miles, and the German defenders knew every inch of the terrain, using it to maximum advantage against the advancing Americans. Thomas survived those weeks through luck and caution, doing his job without heroics, watching and learning as more experienced soldiers around him died or were wounded. He noticed things that others overlooked, how the Germans positioned their machine guns to create overlapping fields of fire, how they used the hedgerows to channel American attacks into killing zones, how they always seemed to know exactly where the weight of an assault would fall. But what haunted Thomas most was the tanks. German armor was a constant threat in the hedgerow country. Panzers would appear suddenly, emerging from concealed positions to devastate American infantry before disappearing again. The tanks moved with a terrible grace, their long guns seeking targets, their treads crushing everything in their path. The psychological effect was as damaging as the physical. Men lived in constant fear of that grinding engine sound, that flash of muzzle fire, that overwhelming sense of helplessness when 30 tons of steel rolled toward you and your rifle was utterly useless against it. Thomas had seen men break under that fear. Good soldiers, brave men, reduced to trembling wrecks by the knowledge that no amount of courage could stop a tank. Thomas watched his first tank battle in late July from a position in a drainage ditch where he had taken cover during an artillery barrage. A column of American Shermans had engaged a group of German Panzers in a wheat field, and the results were devastating. The German tanks, with their superior guns and thicker armor, picked off the Shermans one by one. Thomas counted 4 American tanks destroyed in less than 10 minutes. That night, crouched in a foxhole while artillery rumbled in the distance, Thomas thought about his father's wolf traps. Tanks were not wolves, obviously. They were machines, not animals. But they moved. They had momentum. They had specific relationships with the ground beneath them, and if you understood those relationships well enough, the idea seemed absurd. Tanks were designed to cross trenches. That was literally why they had been invented back in the First War, to roll over the defensive ditches that had made infantry assaults so costly. Every tank commander knew how to handle obstacles. Every tank crew trained for exactly this situation. But Thomas remembered what his father had taught him. The key was not depth, but geometry, the relationship between width, angle, and center of gravity. A trench that a tank could easily cross at one angle might become a death trap at another. He began taking notes, measuring the tracks left by tanks in different soil conditions, observing how Panzers and Shermans behaved when they encountered obstacles, calculating weights, dimensions, speeds. He filled a small notebook with diagrams and numbers that would have meant nothing to anyone else, but formed a coherent theory in his mind. By September, when the Allied advance finally broke out of Normandy and began racing across France, Thomas Garrett had developed a plan. He knew exactly what kind of ditch would flip a Panzer, exactly what dimensions were required, exactly how to conceal it so that a tank commander would not see the danger until it was too late. The theory was complete. The calculations were solid. All he needed was the opportunity to prove it, and commanders willing to let a rancher from Wyoming try something that no military manual had ever described. The opportunity came in late September, when the Allied advance stalled in the Netherlands. Operation Market Garden, the ambitious airborne assault meant to capture bridges across the Rhine and open a path into Germany, had failed. Thousands of paratroopers were dead or captured. The German lines had solidified, and Thomas's division found itself assigned to a sector near the town of Overloon, facing a German counterattack that intelligence predicted would include significant armor. The terrain was different here than in Normandy, flat open farmland with few natural obstacles, perfect tank country. The kind of ground where German armor could exploit its advantages in firepower and protection, rolling over infantry positions with contemptuous ease. The Dutch fields stretched to the horizon, offering no cover, no concealment, no hope for men on foot facing machines built for exactly this kind of warfare. Thomas's platoon was assigned to defend a forward position at the edge of a large field. Their orders were simple: hold the line as long as possible, delay the German advance, buy time for reinforcements to arrive. Everyone understood what this meant. They were sacrificial pieces in a larger game, meant to absorb the enemy's strength before being swept away. The platoon sergeant, a career soldier named Morrison, set his men to digging standard defensive trenches, deep enough for cover, lined with sandbags, positioned for maximum fields of fire. It was textbook defense, exactly what the Army manual prescribed. Thomas approached Morrison on the second day and requested permission to dig additional fortifications ahead of the main trench line. Morrison was skeptical. Additional fortifications meant additional work, and the men were already exhausted. What kind of fortifications? Thomas explained his theory. A series of ditches positioned 30 to 50 yards ahead of the defensive line, concealed beneath branches and mud. When the German tanks advanced, they would drive into these hidden obstacles. The ditches would be too wide to cross easily, too narrow to stop in time, angled precisely to flip the tanks or disable them. Morrison stared at him for a long moment, then laughed. A rancher from Wyoming was going to stop Panzers with holes in the ground. That was rich. That was the funniest thing Morrison had heard since landing in Europe. Thomas did not argue. He simply repeated his request. Morrison, still chuckling, told him to do whatever he wanted, but not to expect any help and not to interfere with the real defensive preparations. Thomas accepted these terms. That night, after his regular duties were complete, he began to dig. He worked alone for the first 2 nights, measuring and excavating with the patient precision he had learned on the ranch. The soil was heavy clay, difficult to move but excellent for his purposes. It would hold its shape and would not collapse under the weight of a tank's approach. He calculated angles based on the Panzer IV's specifications, which he had memorized from captured German documents. He positioned each ditch to create a chain reaction so that tanks avoiding one obstacle would be funneled toward another. On the 3rd night, Private Edward Sullivan approached him. Sullivan was young, barely 19, and terrified of the coming battle. He had watched Thomas working and wanted to understand. Thomas explained, as his father had explained to him, the tank's center of gravity, the relationship between momentum and angle, the precise moment when a vehicle's own weight became its destruction. Sullivan listened with growing wonder. Then he picked up a shovel and started digging. By morning, 2 more men had joined them. By the end of the week, a dozen soldiers were working on the hidden ditch network during their off hours, driven not by belief in Thomas's theory, but by the desperate hope that anything might help them survive the coming assault. Morrison noticed, but said nothing. The men were still completing their regular duties. If they wanted to waste their spare time on a rancher's fantasy, that was their business. The ditches were completed on October 2nd. Thomas walked the field one final time in the fading evening light, checking every angle, adjusting every concealment. The trap was invisible, branches and mud and scattered debris covering excavations that stretched in a precise pattern across 200 yards of open ground. Even knowing exactly where the ditches were, Thomas could barely see them. A tank commander scanning from a moving vehicle would see nothing at all. That night, word came down. German armor had been spotted forming up 3 miles to the east. The attack would come at dawn. Thomas returned to the main trench and waited with the others. He had done everything he could. Now the mathematics of his father's lessons would be tested against 30-ton machines built for war. The German artillery began at first light, a barrage meant to suppress the American defenders and cover the tank advance. Thomas pressed himself against the trench wall as explosions churned the earth around him, showering dirt and debris into the narrow sanctuary where 40 men prayed for survival. The barrage lasted 20 minutes. When it lifted, the silence was almost worse, a held breath before the killing began. Then the tanks appeared. They came over the ridge in a formation that Thomas recognized from his weeks of observation, the armored wedge, with the command tank at the point and others spreading out to either side. 14 Panzers, their grey hulls catching the morning light, their long guns sweeping the field for targets. Behind the tanks came infantry, German soldiers advancing in the shelter of the armor, ready to mop up whatever the tanks left alive. A combined arms assault, executed with the precision that had conquered most of Europe. Thomas counted the distance as the lead tank approached, 500 yards, 400, 300. The tank commander was visible in his open hatch, binoculars raised, scanning the American position. He saw the trench line, the sandbags, the helmeted heads of infantry waiting to die. He saw exactly what he expected to see. A standard defensive position that his tanks would roll over in minutes. He did not see the hidden ditches, 200 yards, 150, 100. The American soldiers began firing, rifles cracking, a machine gun chattering, but the shots bounced harmlessly off the Panzer's armor. The tank commander ducked into his hatch and buttoned up. The advance continued without slowing. 75 yards, 50, 30. Thomas held his breath. The lead Panzer reached the first hidden ditch. Its front treads dropped into empty space. The driver, feeling the sudden pitch forward, probably slammed on the brakes, but momentum was already in control. The tank's nose dug into the far wall of the ditch and its rear end lifted off the ground. For one eternal second, the Panzer hung at an impossible angle, balanced on its nose like some massive steel acrobat. Thomas could see the tank commander's hatch fly open, could see the man inside trying to escape. Then gravity won, and the tank flipped. It crashed onto its back with a sound like thunder, blocking the ditch completely. The engine died, the treads spun uselessly in the air, and the second Panzer, following 20 yards behind, had no time to react. The second tank tried to veer right and found another section of the hidden ditch network. Its tracks dropped in at an angle, and the entire vehicle tilted sideways, rolling once, twice, before coming to rest on its side in a cloud of mud and debris. The third tank tried to stop and was rear-ended by the fourth. The fifth found a ditch on the left flank. The sixth and seventh collided, trying to avoid the growing chaos. Thomas watched the destruction unfold with something between triumph and disbelief. His calculations had been theoretical, based on observations and measurements and principles learned on a Wyoming ranch. He had believed they would work, but belief was not the same as certainty. Now certainty was crashing and burning across the field in front of him. The German infantry, suddenly without armored cover, faltered and stopped. The Panzers that had not yet reached the ditch line were reversing, their commanders screaming orders that no one could follow. Smoke rose from a ruptured fuel tank. Flames licked at another overturned hull. Morrison was shouting, ordering the men to fire on the exposed infantry to exploit the chaos. The American rifles that had been useless against tank armor were devastating against unprotected soldiers caught in the open. Edward Sullivan was beside Thomas, firing his M1 Garand with mechanical precision, tears streaming down his face. Whether they were tears of fear or relief or simple overwhelming emotion, Thomas could not tell. The engagement lasted less than 30 minutes. When it was over, 14 German tanks were destroyed or disabled. The infantry assault had broken and retreated, and 40 American soldiers who should have died were still alive, protected by nothing more than holes in the ground. Thomas sat against the trench wall, his rifle across his knees, staring at the field of overturned tanks. His hands were shaking. His mind was empty. He had been right, and being right had kept his friends alive. But the German soldiers who had burned in those tanks, they had been someone's sons too, someone's friends, someone's hope for the future. War did not allow you to forget that, no matter how clever your victory. The mathematics of destruction did not care about the men who died inside the numbers. The aftermath brought chaos of a different kind. Officers arrived within hours, first the company commander, then the battalion commander. Then a procession of increasingly senior brass who had heard impossible reports and needed to see for themselves. The field at Overloon became a classroom, with Thomas Garrett as the reluctant instructor. He walked the officers through the ditch network, explaining the principles, showing the measurements, describing the theory behind each angle and dimension. Some of them understood immediately. Others never quite grasped how a rancher's knowledge of cattle guards could translate into an anti-tank weapon. But all of them recognized that something significant had happened. The Army's way of recognizing significance was documentation. Thomas spent 3 days answering questions, drawing diagrams, writing reports that would disappear into the military bureaucracy. He was photographed, standing next to the overturned tanks. He was interviewed by a correspondent for Stars and Stripes, who wanted a hero story for the folks back home. Thomas hated every moment of it. He was not a hero. He was a rancher who had applied his father's lessons to a new kind of problem. The men who had died in those tanks had been no less brave than he was, no less devoted to their cause. They had simply encountered an obstacle they did not expect, designed by someone who thought differently than their training had prepared them for. The recognition came anyway. A Bronze Star, presented by a general whose name Thomas forgot almost immediately. A promotion to staff sergeant, which meant more responsibility and less time with the men he had learned to trust. Transfer orders to a planning unit, where his unconventional thinking could be applied to future operations. Thomas accepted it all without complaint, because refusing would have drawn even more attention. But at night, alone in whatever billet the Army had assigned him, he thought about the German tank commanders who had driven into his trap. Young men, probably, trained soldiers doing their duty. They had trusted their machines and their training, and both had failed them. His father had never taught him how to feel about that. There was no geometry for grief, no calculation that could balance lives saved against lives taken. The war continued. The Allies pushed into Germany through the bitter winter of 1944-45, fighting through the Ardennes, crossing the Rhine, advancing toward a final victory that seemed both inevitable and endlessly delayed. Thomas contributed to planning operations, applying his geometric principles to problems of defense and obstacle placement. He was good at it. He saved lives. But he never again experienced anything like the 4 minutes at Overloon, when his theory had transformed from calculation to carnage in front of his eyes. Germany surrendered in May 1945. Thomas was in a headquarters unit near Frankfurt when the news came, surrounded by officers and clerks who celebrated with confiscated champagne and dreams of going home. The war that had consumed 6 years and millions of lives was finally over. Thomas did not celebrate. He walked outside, found a quiet spot behind a ruined building, and sat alone until the stars came out. He thought about his father, who had died in 1943 without ever knowing what his lessons about wolf traps would become. He thought about the men he had served with, the ones who had lived and the ones who had not. He thought about the German soldiers whose final moments had been spent tumbling through the air in steel coffins. He did not cry. He was not sure he remembered how, but he sat there for a long time, letting the silence of the European night wash over him, waiting for something that felt like peace. It did not come. Thomas Garrett returned to Wyoming in September 1945, discharged with honors and decorations that meant nothing to him. His mother was waiting at the ranch, older now, worn by years of managing the property alone, and she held him for a long time without speaking. The ranch had changed during his absence. Fences needed repair, buildings needed maintenance. The herd had dwindled to half its pre-war size, but the land was the same. The vast open spaces, the mountains on the horizon, the creek that ran through the lower pasture, where his father had once built wolf traps that changed Thomas's life. He threw himself into the work of restoration with the same focused intensity he had brought to everything in his life. The physical labor was a relief after years of planning and thinking and calculating death. His muscles remembered how to dig post holes, how to string wire, how to move through the landscape with the easy confidence of someone who belonged there. The land did not judge him. The cattle did not ask questions about the war. The work simply needed to be done, and doing it left no room for darker thoughts. But the nightmares followed him home. He dreamed of tanks, not the American Shermans he had ridden past 100 times, but German Panzers flipping and burning, their crews screaming in languages he did not understand. He dreamed of the field at Overloon, of the 4 minutes that had made him famous among men he did not know. He dreamed of his father, standing at the edge of a ditch asking questions that Thomas could not answer. He did not speak of these dreams. In post-war Wyoming, men did not speak of such things. They worked and drank and married and raised children and buried whatever darkness they had brought back from Europe in the same hard ground that their ancestors had claimed from the wilderness. Thomas married in 1947, a woman named Eleanor who had grown up in Sheridan and remembered him from before the war. She was patient and kind and did not ask questions about the medals in his dresser drawer or the way he sometimes woke, gasping in the middle of the night. She gave him 3 children over the following decade, 2 boys and a girl who grew up knowing their father as a quiet rancher, not as the man who had flipped 14 Panzers with holes in the ground. The story faded from public memory, as war stories do. The veterans who had been at Overloon scattered across America, building lives that had nothing to do with trenches and tanks. The military documents that described Thomas's technique were filed away in archives that no one visited. The field itself was plowed and planted, the ditches filled in, the overturned tanks hauled away for scrap. By 1960, Thomas Garrett was just another rancher in a landscape full of ranchers, a man who knew his land, worked hard, raised his family, and kept his own counsel about what he had seen and done in the war. But sometimes, in quiet moments, he would walk out to the pasture where his father had built those first wolf traps. The ditches were long gone, filled in by decades of weather and neglect. But Thomas remembered exactly where they had been, exactly how they had been angled, exactly how they had worked. His sons asked him once why he spent so much time staring at that empty pasture. Thomas considered the question for a long moment before answering. "Your grandfather taught me something here," he said. "He taught me that every creature has a weakness if you know how to look. The trick is not strength. The trick is understanding." The boys nodded as if they understood, though they did not really. They were too young to know about Panzers and war and the weight of lives that had been ended by their father's understanding. But someday they would be old enough, and perhaps then the lessons of a Wyoming rancher would find new meaning. Thomas died in 1989, at the age of 77, on a quiet autumn morning when the aspens on the mountain slopes had turned to gold. His children buried him on the ranch, next to Eleanor and his parents, and the generations of Garretts who had worked this land before him. The headstone listed his name, his dates, and a simple phrase that Eleanor had chosen before her own death. He understood the ground. A few years later, a military historian researching unconventional tactics in World War II found references to the Overloon tank trap in Army archives. He tracked down Thomas's family and interviewed the surviving sons about their father's service. The sons shared what they knew, fragments of stories, half-remembered details, the medals that still sat in a dresser drawer where their father had placed them decades ago and never touched again. They shared the small notebook their father had kept during the war, filled with diagrams and calculations that meant nothing to them, but clearly described something important. The historian studied the notebook with growing wonder. Here was a complete theory of geometric warfare, developed by a rancher using principles learned from cattle guards and wolf traps. Here was proof that sometimes the most important innovations come not from military academies or engineering schools, but from people who look at problems differently, who bring knowledge from unexpected places to challenges that seem impossible. He wrote about Thomas Garrett in his book, Restoring the Story to History. And now, decades later, that story has found its way to you. If this story moved you, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Share in the comments what touched you most, and tell us where you are watching from today. These stories survive when we remember them together, and together, we ensure that the wisdom of ordinary people who did extraordinary things is never forgotten, never lost to the passage of time. The men who mocked Thomas Garrett were not fools. They were trained soldiers who understood war as it had always been fought. But Thomas understood something different, something his father had taught him on a ranch in Wyoming, something about momentum and geometry, and the precise moment when a creature's own strength becomes its weakness. They called his trap stupid. Then they watched 14 Panzers flip in a single morning, their crews never understanding what had happened until it was too late. And they learned what Thomas had always known, that the ground itself can be a weapon if you understand how to use it.